Morning. So we're going to be in Genesis 5 most of the day today. We're going to get a running start by looking at Genesis 4, at least the last verse, because we didn't cover it last week. And because Genesis 5 is mostly just a genealogy, we're going to take a little bit of time at the end to sort of sum up some things that maybe we've addressed, maybe we haven't addressed, and just sort of wrap a couple of things up before we move into the long story of the flood. Just to let you know, we are not meeting next week. I am expecting a delivery at home, so someone has to be there to receive it and get it in the garage. That's going to be me. So I'll be working at home next Wednesday morning, so we will not have class on the 16th. So we'll have to come to the flood later. Anyhow, so to start with, we have the last line of Genesis 4. At that time, men, humans, began to call on the name of the Lord. So Genesis 4 and 5 especially are contrasting the two lines of men. So you've got the line of Cain, and we looked at that last week, and the line of Cain climaxes in Lamech, who is filled with vengeance. You know, if my forefather Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech is avenged 77 times. So this violent line of Cain sort of comes to this huge crescendo with Lamech. And then at the very end of chapter 4, we have the introduction of a new line. Since the line of Abel has been killed, now we have Seth, and Seth is going to be the line of promise. And actually most of chapter 5 is going to be this sort of discourse on the line of Seth. I'm not 100% sure what to make of at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord, except to sort of contrast that from the beginning there are those who are faithful to the Lord and to the worship that they would have inherited out of Eden, and there are those who are not. It becomes an interesting question. I don't know if we'll get to it this season or not. It becomes an interesting question, especially with Abram. Abram is described other places in the Bible as having grown up with idolaters, with the worshipers of false gods. So even in the good line, the Seth line, it seems like true worship is always kind of the minority position, and that humanity falls away from its God very, very quickly, invents other sorts of gods, values other sorts of things, and the worship of the true God becomes this sort of miraculous life preserver, bobbing along on the stream of men's wickedness. So it comes across as kind of a God thing, a blessing that the worship of God remains engaged. So I think that's what's going on with at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord. I maintain that at least part of what it means to be in the image of God is that humans are naturally religious beings. Any number of atheists would object to that. But even the atheist is dealing with some kind of a worldview. And whether he understands it as religious or not, it is in fact religious. Human beings are constantly trying to construct meaning. I had this conversation on last week with someone about the whole God has a plan thing. And actually Pastor Firetog was there too, and we both just sort of said, we don't love it. But I think part of the reason it's so prevalent is because humans are always trying to find some sort of coherence in the world around us. And if you're an obviously religious person, then you want to say God has a plan for this, that there is purpose here. But even if you're not an overtly religious person, you're still looking for that kind of purpose. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, in the end of the 19th century, looked unflinchingly into what atheism would really be like, a world without values. He hypothesized that morality was just a human construct, and it was something humans constructed to keep other people in their place, and that the goal was to be the Superman, the Übermensch, the one who could turn the wheel of history by the force of your own will. And Nietzsche was crazy. Seriously, he was probably bipolar or something. There'd be a diagnosis for him today. In the 19th century, they simply called him insane. You don't want to make that necessarily that connection, but it seems like looking into such a dark abyss of purposelessness didn't help Nietzsche one little bit. Anyhow, humans are searching for meaning, they're constructors of meaning, and that means that inherently they're religious. Lots of people will do it with the false religions or no religion, but ultimately there's this sort of religious sense to the whole thing. I think all that's tied up in the idea that at the very dawn of our race, worship becomes an integral part of who we are. And specifically, I think verse 26 introduces us then to, prepares us for chapter 5, which is then the account of the line of Seth, which is going to be the line that carries the promise. So that's our get-go to start with. Chapter 5 says this is the written account of Adam's line. So account is this word toledoth that we bumped into several weeks ago, and it's a word that kind of appears like 10 times, something like that, I forget the exact number, throughout Genesis. It structures Genesis in some ways. Here it's a written account, making you wonder if Moses had access to some sort of a prior written account that he's working from. Hard to say. But it is the account of Adam's line. And verse 1 takes us back to Genesis 1. When God created man, Adam, humans, he made Adam, humans, in the likeness of God. He created them, male and female, as we saw in Genesis 1, so that there is this duality to humans, and the plurality of humans, the otherness of other humans is part of the image of God. Just as God is triune and Father, Son, and Spirit retain their own individual personalities, so man and woman form one race, humanity. And he blessed them, and he called them man. That kind of underscores the point I was making through Genesis 1. So he called them Adam. Verse 3 then shows the shift of sin. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness. So now something new has been added here. Now the children of Adam are not just in the image of God, although I still think that we retain some sense of the image of God. But now they also bear the image of their father, which is, I think, what Paul is getting at when he talks in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 about the sin of Adam. That this is the likeness of Adam, the brokenness of Adam. So when we talk about original sin and what that does to a human, how that makes a human, we're talking about having inherited the likeness of our first father, Adam. So likeness not in the sense of appearance, but likeness in the sense of similarity, that Adam now has passed on this moral brokenness to his children, to us. Sorry, I told you, got a little gunk going on here. So Adam bears Seth. I mentioned last week, it seems very unlikely to me that there was no one born between Abel and Seth. I don't know. It seems unlikely to me. There are, but the line is counted through Seth, which is not unusual. Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn, but he's not the child of Sarah. so Isaac gets the birthright. Esau's firstborn, but Jacob gets the birthright. And with the descendants of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, it's actually the fourth-born, Judah, who gets the birthright. So firstborn doesn't always guarantee the birthright and the blessing. There are a lot of questions that we simply will not be able to answer that we might like to have answers to. So, for example, it says when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness. So, is that 130 years from his creation? Is that 130 years from the fall? What's that 130 years from? Excuse me, it's really struggling here. Are all the numbers of Genesis 5 meant to be taken literally? And these are all questions that we're just not going to be able to answer. So we're going to come back and talk about the years in a little bit. For right now, maybe the one thing that we want to see is the structure of the genealogy. It is a 10-generation genealogy. Adam to Seth, Seth to Enoch, Enoch to Kenan, Kenan to Mahalalel, say that 10 times real fast, Mahalalel to Jared, Jared to Enoch, Enoch to Methuselah, who's famous for being the oldest man in the Bible, Methuselah to a different Lamech, and then Lamech on to Noah. So 10 generations, and the 7th generation stands out in particular because the 7th generation is Enoch. And Enoch is described very differently than the rest of them. He breaks the pattern. So in all the other generations, we had father lived X number of years and became the father of son. And then he lived another X number of years, and this is the total. But we have a different pattern with Enoch. So if we look at chapter 5, verse 21, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. He was a young one when he had kids, comparatively. Some of these guys are in their hundreds. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. So that he walked with God marks him out as somehow special. It's not said of anybody else. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him away. Referenced for us in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that great hall of fame for the faithful, and the author of the Hebrews makes the comment, by faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he could not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. So, similar to Elijah, many, many hundreds of years later, in the book of 2 Kings, Enoch apparently is spared the catastrophe of temporal death. He's just taken directly into heaven. Again, not much that we can know about that. Enoch does not come up a lot in the Bible. He is mentioned in the book of Jude, he's mentioned in the book of Hebrews, he's mentioned here. But because of this verse that Enoch walked with God, in later Jewish tradition, especially the period between the Testaments, so 100, 200 years before Jesus until about around that period or so, a little after Jesus, Enoch took on this sort of mythic status within later Judaism. There's actually a series of books, the books of Enoch, which clearly written near the time of Jesus, but are attributed to this Enoch. And as they go sort of rooting around through their history, looking for someone who can explain how the world is, they fasten on Enoch here. All we can say is that Enoch is, Moses goes out of his way to portray Enoch as a godly man. That's really all we can say. And that for some reason, whatever it is, he does not experience death as most people do. There's not a lot more you can say about it because that's all the text says. and everything else is just based on later speculation. Then you have Methuselah, of course, verse 25 to 27 there. He lives almost 1,000 years, 969 years. That's why he's famous. Of all these extraordinary ages, his is the longest. He has a Lamech, but a different Lamech. So now, interestingly, we sort of have the end of Genesis 4 coming back. So you had the Cainite Lamech, who was, I'll avenge myself 77 times, and Mr. Violence and Mr. Oppression. And now you have the Sethite Lamech at the end of this chapter. And he has a child named Noah, and again breaks the pattern. 10th generation breaks the pattern. Noah, because he will comfort us in the labor and the painful toil of our hands, setting us up for Noah's story with the great flood, which will come up in the next chapter, in chapter 6. Noah sounds a great deal like the word for comfort, is what's going on there. So it's a pun, a play on words there. So there are the 10 generations between Adam and Noah. Before we start sort of digging into some of the deeper issues, any thoughts or questions, anything you want to comment on there? Okay, so the first thing we have to notice is that this genealogy, like most genealogies, is clearly stylized. There are 10 generations. We bumped into this in our study of Revelation a few months ago. 10 is one of those numbers that bears a lot of symbolic freight, sort of the completeness of human accomplishment or whatever it is. And the fact that the 7th generation stands out as the particular godly generation with Enoch, that stands out as well. So you see the same thing, for example, in Matthew 1, where Matthew starts with Jesus' genealogy, and it's so clearly schematized. There are 7 generations from here to here, that's 14 generations, and there are 7 generations from here to here, and that's 14 generations, and there are 17 generations from here to here, and that's 14 generations. And anybody who's sort of steeped in biblical numerology is thinking, okay, that's 6 sevens, you know it has to come next. A 7th 7. It's got to. It's just how things work. You see it in the prophet Amos. It's the beautiful piece of writing. Amos has this condemnation of the nations. For 3 sins of Edom I will not relent. For 4. 3 plus 4 is 7. And then he addresses 7 nations surrounding Judah. And like, yeah, give it to him, Amos. Give it to him. And then he adds an 8th. And he comes after Judah itself. So this notion of things built on 7s and 10s, it's just really part of how Hebrew language and Hebrew literature and the Hebrew mind works. So what does that mean? It's probably not exhaustive. Probably not exhaustive. It probably is the case that there are more than just these 10 guys. Okay? It also means that we have to dance carefully around the numbers, around the age at which these men and boys were born, and the ages that these men lived to. This is one of those places that I think it's important for us to say, we don't always know everything about the Bible that we think we ought to know. We've talked about that before. It is an ancient book, and there are things that we simply don't know. So I'm going to read you a paragraph out of this commentary. I thought it was very interesting. Regarding the numbers, and it's not exhaustive, but it addresses some of them. So here's a scholar, and it says, and he has proposed connections between the ages of the pre-flood and the astronomical periods of the Babylonians. For instance, Enoch's 365 years equal the days of the year in the Babylonian calendar. Lamech's 777 years equal what he calls the synodic periods of Jupiter and Saturn. So it's tied into how into their astrology and their observation of the planets. Jared's 962 years are equal to the periods of Venus and Saturn. The sum of the years at the time of the fathering and the total lifespans are each divisible by 60, based on Babylonian love of the number 6. The sum of the remainders is 365. That might sound far-fetched, right, to the modern ear, but I think it probably makes sense in the way that the ancients understood time. So, a couple of things. The genealogies probably are not exhaustive. Therefore, Bishop Ussher, writing in the 19th century, who did the math on the dates and the lives of these guys, and then tried to work back from Jesus and said, hey, look, the world is 6,000 years old. Probably not the best approach. There are certainly conservative Christians who think that is exactly the thing you ought to do. And when they argue for a young earth, they're looking at these numbers and saying, see, the world is really no more than 6,000 years old. I would maintain that the Bible is unashamedly young earth. Here's a point of comparison. We have similar records from Sumer of lists of ancient kings with extraordinary lifespans. So here we have a list of 10 men in their generations, and they add up to 1,646 years, if I did the math right. Okay? 10 guys over the course of 1,646 years. The Sumerians have 8 kings whose total lives and reigns add up to 241,000 years. So, in some ways, you see Genesis 5 taking a poke at that and saying, you know, wasn't that long. You guys are just making stuff up. So it seems to me that the Bible is just unashamedly young earth. Having said that, what do we mean by young earth? I personally am comfortable with anything around 100,000 years, which is orders of magnitude different than, what is it, Rich? 4.5 billion years?
4.3.
4.3. I was close, see? Not even a geologist, and I was close. But that's 3 orders of magnitude difference, right? So, young earth, yes, but maybe not, probably not 6,000 years young. So we have to be kind of take these genealogies, this one in particular, with a little grain of salt. And the grain of salt says, we don't know exactly what's going on here. There are some pretty clever ideas about what's going on here based on Babylonian astrology, and maybe that's part of what's going on here. Probably it's not exhaustive because there's clearly indications that this is symbolically arranged with the 7 and the 10. But what we do have is a sense that God is preserving the true worship of His name among this line of Seth. That's sort of the general idea that's going on here until we get to Noah. And it's going to be interesting when we get to Noah, because there is a line in Genesis 6 that is just astonishing to me. The Lord looks on the world in Noah's day, and He sees that, ready for it? Every inclination of the human heart is only evil all the time. That's 3 absolutes. Every inclination, only evil all the time. Except for Noah. So it seems to me that the sort of lesson of Genesis 5, when you get right down to what are we supposed to learn from this, is not about age of the earth or numbers or remarkable ages of people. Rather, it's to say, look, God preserves true worship, and he's going to preserve it. And as Christians, we see it being preserved then through the line of Abram, and we see it being preserved through Israel all the way into Jesus. So there is this sense of God's faithfulness to the promise that he made in Genesis 3 that I think is probably the main point to take away. So be a little careful around the numbers and what we do with those numbers. Thoughts on that before we go to some summing up kind of things? Questions? Pushbacks? Peter?
Is it safe to say that based upon what we're dealing with is the fact that God created the world, and then would you say he immediately created Adam after the creation of the world?
So again, the Bible itself, outside of Genesis 1, leaves no question that the Scripture believes the world is created in 6 days.
Yes.
There's no question about it. And Adam and Eve are created on the sixth day. Because when the Sabbath is commanded, that's specifically what's said. The Lord your God worked for 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. So in terms of the creation, the Bible never entertains any possibility other than Adam is created on Friday and God rests on Saturday. I mean, they didn't call it Friday and Saturday, but you know what I mean. So in terms of the creation, there's never a doubt in the Scripture that it's a 6-day thing. So yeah, I think what you're saying is safe to say. Yeah, Adam is God's special creation.
Okay, so then when you go back to the BC time, what number did they start with to get to?
What number did they start with? So the numbering of time always depends on your culture and where you stand. BC doesn't make any sense until Jesus is born. And Jesus is born in about the year 70. What do they call that? I forget the abbreviation they use. AUC, something like that. It's from the founding of the city. So if you were a Roman, Jesus is born in about 753 from the founding of the city, because that's how the Romans counted it. When was Rome founded? Everything else dates from that. The Egyptians counted time in terms of the dynasties of their pharaohs. This is the first dynasty, this is the second dynasty, this is the third dynasty. The Sumerians counted time from this king's list, which counted for 240,000 years. So how you count time always depends on sort of where you stand and how you do that.
But then everything came together and everybody started with what, the year one?
Well, that's the fact that we all count time as we do right now is really European imperialism. No one counted this way until about 300 or 400 years, maybe it was even longer than that, after Jesus. And some monk in Europe decided to figure out when Jesus was born, and they started counting time that way and deciding everything. It's actually why, believe it or not, most likely Jesus is born in about 4 BC, because he made a couple of mistakes along the way. So Jesus, ironically, is born before Christ. So that's just cultural imperialism. In the same way that world clocks are attuned to Greenwich, England. You guys know that? Yeah. Yep. That's where the zero meridian is. Why? You want to know why? Because the British devised the system of meridians. Now we've worked a little bit to ease the imperialistic overtones of that. We still sometimes use the language of Greenwich Mean Time, but sometimes that's replaced by Zulu time, just to try to use something that's a little bit more, I don't know, not so English. And the vast majority of scholars do not use BC and AD anymore. The vast majority of history is written with the abbreviations CE, that is in the Common Era, and BCE, before the Common Era. It's still the same year numbers, but they've taken the particulars out of it to try to make it a little less odious. So, how people count time kind of depends where you're standing, And you even think of the ancients, and, if you do enough reading around ancient people, very often you will find in their biography, for example, Julius Caesar, B period CA period 100 BCE, born around 100 BCE. I mean, they didn't have birth certificates. The day you were born, say, oh, look, he was born right then. So there's a lot of puzzles to solve in terms of how you count time. We just happen to have posed our system on the rest of the world. So let's do a little summing up here and just sort of talk a little bit about some of the hard issues here. So first of all, we have to say that we need to read Genesis for what it is and not for what we wish it was. There's lots of questions that we wish it would answer. It is not primarily a scientific textbook. It is not primarily geology or biology. In a lot of ways, it's not even primarily history. It's primarily theology. So remember, when we started this whole thing, we saw the way that the creation account was meant to undermine pagan creation accounts with the sea and the earth and terrible beasts and the gods being born out of the carcasses and all that kind of weird stuff that we bumped into. And so in many ways, the Genesis creation account is very much theological and anti-pagan in its approach. Genesis 2 is in many ways anti-pagan in its approach. In the pagan origin myths, the humans are a burden to the gods and trouble to the gods and often slaves to the gods. But in Genesis 2, humans are uplifted as those who bear the image of God and tend his temple, and the world is his temple, centered in Eden. So that's the kind of thing that's going on here in terms of what Genesis intends to be. If we want to learn lessons about science from it, you have to look at it from an angle that it's not really designed to be looked at from. I don't know. TVs. And I forget which one it is, if it's the LEDs or the plasma TVs, but as TVs developed the last 20 years, there's a certain style that's meant to be looked at from in front of it. And if you're not right in front of it, everything is off. So as flat screen TVs started to come up, if you were looking at the room sideways, they would say, this is not the TV for you, because it's gonna look wrong. You can still see some pictures. You'll see them differently than everybody else sees them. So we can maybe think a little bit about timelines and origins and science. As I said before, Genesis, this early part of Genesis, is unabashedly young Earth. 1,600 years as opposed to 240,000 years for the Sumerians. So as we think then about origins, and we think, okay, so we have this story in Genesis 1 that says God creates the world in 6 days, and this portrayal of a young Earth, and yet science would tell us that the world is very much older than that. The universe is very much older than that. 1,000, 1,000,000 times older than that. So what do we do? What do we do with that? I think one of the possibilities that we might have to entertain is I sometimes think we just have to think creatively about the problem. So you guys know The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? That's C.S. Lewis's book in the Chronicles of Narnia. Well, that's actually a 7-book series. And one of the books in the series is called The Magician's Nephew. And there is this scene in The Magician's Nephew where the magician's nephew is witness to the creation of Narnia. And Aslan, this lion who is the Christ figure, the God figure in the thing, he is singing to an unformed world. And as he sings to this unformed world, everything just sort of blossoms in front of him. And the image is that the trees just sort of grow up in an instant. They do grow up, but they grow up in an instant. So maybe part of the puzzle of science is just because science wants to find explanations that would never include God. And maybe the sense of age is just part of the nature of the thing, and that God has manipulated time somehow, as things that we think would happen very, very slowly, he caused to happen very quickly. I think that's something we have to at least contemplate, that God can cause things to happen much faster than they would have. He does that with the creation of Adam. He puts him together and blows breath into him, and he's an adult. So he doesn't go through that whole 18-year process of growing up. So I think that's something that helps us sort of conceive of why it is that Genesis and science are sometimes in conflict. And maybe it's just that God manipulated things, that they grew up very quickly, even though now they have the appearance of being very, very old. I don't know. I'm no philosopher. I've just always thought The Magician's Nephew that passage was one of the more profound in Lewis's writings. In terms of the discrepancy of science and the Bible too, I think sometimes we have to be willing to say maybe science doesn't always know what it's talking about. That's a possibility too. Rich would have much more expertise in this, but I've got some doubts regarding the way that these dates are determined. They often will use what's called radiometric dating, and they will look at the half-life of particular isotopes. And there are some things along the way that may not be super helpful. I was reading a thing just this morning. They used to use uranium-lead dating, comparing the isotopes of uranium and lead in the rocks, only to realize that some of the chemical properties of lead and uranium actually make the system not all that reliable, because in a volcanic moment where everything's molten and magma, there are some things that will throw off those kind of calculations. You know that you're dealing with someone who doesn't know what they're talking about in terms of geology when they try to argue for carbon dating. Carbon dating works for things that are based on, wait for it, carbon. So carbon dating only works on organic stuff. And even then, I just bumped into this piece. I didn't read the whole thing, not qualified to judge the science, who suggested that as humans have unearthed more and more fossil fuels, we have maybe changed the very nature of the calculations, that maybe these things aren't terribly accurate as we thought they were. So there's some questions about the science of how these things are dated. You guys ever been to the Grand Canyon? All over the Grand Canyon there are signs, right? Look at the strata. As you go down the Grand Canyon, going down is fine. Coming out of the Grand Canyon stinks. Holy cow. That was the longest mile I ever walked in my life. I thought I was going to die. But they say, look at the strata and how this is all laid down. So there's this wide assumption that it's laid down gradually over lots of time, as opposed to maybe happening catastrophically rather quickly. So At least the way that it's popularly taught at like the high school level, which is my knowledge of science. I think that there are some questions that we can ask of science that says, maybe that didn't really happen the way you thought it happened. And maybe some of these assumptions need to be challenged. Like I said, Rich would be a lot more qualified to talk about these things than I am because he has much more than a high school education in them. So I don't know if you care to pop off at all, Rich.
You look at the fossil record and everything occurs normally, and then all of a sudden they get something where that's not right. They call it inversion.
Yeah.
Or God threw a clinker in there. This doesn't make sense. It just.
Yeah. Which means that science, and the best scientists are always willing to challenge their hypotheses. So that's the nature of science. They're always willing to challenge what they thought they knew. Sometimes it's very difficult. I think of the trouble that like Copernicus got into when he suggested that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the earth. And in that case, it was the church who had real problems with him, but turns out he was right. The sun does not move around the earth moves around the sun. And we have models to prove this. We have evidence for this. So scientific change sometimes happens slowly, but there has to be an openness to say maybe we got something wrong here in terms of the science of the thing. The one aspect of the conversation about origins that I'm more conversant in is biological evolution. And I would just suggest that most of what we see in terms of biology is things losing genetic material. And as they lose genetic information, they become less and less stable. So my poster child for this is the poodle. Anybody have a poodle? Ever have a poodle? They don't really raise a lot of poodles anymore. They mix poodles with a ton of other stuff. Labradors and golden retrievers and all sorts of stuff. You get all sorts of cute little doggies out of that. Poodles, as I understand it, are notoriously subject to a ton of genetic problems because they've been bred so specifically for the curly hair, for the height, for the shape, that you breed out other characteristics. So that what we see mostly in nature is an overall loss of genetic information. Evolution only works if you have the addition of genetic information. And I'm not talking about taking the poodle and breeding him back with the wolf and saying, there, we have more information. He's a better dog for sure, but he's still a dog. It's still genetically a dog. It's not a cat, and it's not going to become a cat because it's a different genetic pattern. So we don't really observe a ton of places, I don't know that we observe any places really, where we have new genetic material being added. But because biological evolution has become such an ideology that this is the way it must happen, we do find people who use the language of evolution very sloppily. So, for example, we are coming out of a pandemic after 2 years. And generally, the scientific press has reported it well, and they have reported on different variants. So you had the Alpha, the original, and then there was Delta, and there's Omicron, and there was one other one in there someplace. Variants, but when you say it's a variant, what are you saying? It's still the same virus. Every now and then you bumped into someone who says it's evolved. I haven't noticed that so much with the pandemic. I have noticed that in terms of some other viruses, for example, MRSA and antibiotic-resistant viruses, you'll often hear people say, see, they've evolved a resistance against the antibiotic. And my answer is, no, they haven't. You know what you did? you killed all the ones that were susceptible to the antibiotic. So the only ones that were left were the ones that were resistant to the antibiotic. It's not a new virus, it's a stronger virus. That's all it is. It's the same virus, but you've killed all the ones that were weak. It literally is survival of the fittest. So, even in terms of evolutionary, biological evolution, there are problems to ask along the way, and certainly there are people who are a lot smarter than us who deal with these things, but I think it's something that we can at least say, I'm not sure that works like you think it works. One last thing to say, I think, about especially biological evolution. I learned this from a young lady in my last congregation. She was a PhD in microbiology from the University of Michigan. This is no mean school. I mean, this is a good school. This is a solid degree. And I recall her saying one time to me that it didn't matter to her where the cell came from. Didn't matter. It mattered what the cell was and what the cell did. So the present of the cell mattered a great deal to her, and in her mind, any attempt to explain where the cell came from was interesting but kind of pointless. In some ways, on the question of origin, in terms of science, you have to ask the question, who cares where it came from? Why does it matter? What does matter with this mineral is not where it came from, but whether it'll work on my cell phone or not. That's the thing that matters, And what matters with this cell is not where it came from, but can I heal it? Those are the things that really matter. So in some ways, the whole question of origins just seems kind of overblown to me. Anyhow, that's just kind of me preaching about some sum up kind of things. We didn't really deal with the science very much because it's just not what Genesis is for, but I thought it should at least sort of be put out there. Thoughts, questions? Counterpoints, arguments? Rich? Rich wanted to get into this. This was why Rich requested Genesis 1 through 11. So,
Isn't it obvious that this is where science and religion clash right here at Genesis? This is where...
see, I struggle with that, Pete. I don't know that science and religion clash. I think...
apparently very tremendous amount of scientists who are Christian.
Yeah. So this isn't. Yeah. This is an area where I would not say that science and faith clash. I would say that the ideology of some science and faith clash. So it's not the science itself necessarily. So here's an example. I read this book years ago. And I can't remember what it was called anymore, but it was basically an intellectual biography of Darwin. And my takeaway from this book was that Darwin himself was not an atheist, but he observed a world that he had a hard time accommodating to a good God. So his idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest, the mechanisms of evolution that he's the father of, were in a sense an attempt by him not to deny God, but to insulate God from evil in the world. Now, people who've adopted Darwin's evolutionary theories have often wanted a godless system. So it's not so much that the science necessarily disagrees, it's the ideology of the science which wants a closed universe without any external influences into it. So again, it's a place we have to be a little careful. I tell confirmation kids all the time, you can be a Christian and a world-class scientist. There's absolutely nothing about being a Christian that says you can't go to university and study science and be really good at it and make a really good living and maybe cure a disease someday. Just be careful with...
It means science.
Yeah. Right.
Overall, I'm far more referring to the fact of scientists that study the physical world or the universe, that of science.
Yeah. Right.
All of practically could become this,
Yeah.
where we live is a speck
Yeah.
in the overall universe. And I'm referring to that part of science.
No, I understand. And all I'm saying is I want to be careful that we don't raise a generation that thinks science and Christianity are incompatible. I want them to understand that there is a belief system that goes along with a lot of how scientists approach things that is incompatible. But the belief system that goes along with a lot of how scientists approach the ideology of science isn't necessary to doing science. You don't have to imagine a godless world in order to do science. Matter of fact, the disciplines of science, in many ways, grew up among Christians who were fascinated by the world God had created. And now, somehow, the ideology of science has turned it on its head to make it seem like faith is the enemy of science. It's not. We're both investigating the world. One of us claims it's God's world. One of us is trying to do it without God. And just, so it's sort of be aware of the underlying worldview that you'll bump into if you go to university and study science. And just be prepared for that. So I'm just real cautious about.
Out of the realm of science itself, but thinking somewhat along these lines is the fact that I think one of the things that's extremely hard to understand, and in fact it's obviously beyond our understanding, God always was, always was. I mean, how far back does that go? Well, it's beyond our thinking. You can't.
Yeah. Even that, though, gets into philosophical stuff. So if you're going to take the sort of really strongly materialistic approach to science, and you're going to buy the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker, you say, okay, so the Earth is like 4 billion years old, but the universe is even older than that, and you go all the way back to the Big Bang, and what's the Big Bang? Well, at some point, a hyper-compressed ball of material exploded all over the place, right?
Where did that come from?
Exactly. This is what I talk about with worldview and the basic presuppositions. The Christian and the atheist, the materialist, have the same basic problem. The Christian's problem is where did God come from? The materialist's problem is where did stuff come from? Where did material come from? At some point, something exists. For myself, I find it less difficult to believe that an all-powerful being existed than that stuff existed. Unless we think this is a modern problem, this is a problem that people have dealt with all the way back to the ancient Greeks 600 years before Jesus. So we really got to go, guys. It's way after time. Thank you for the conversation. Let's close with a prayer. Remember, we are not meeting next week, but we'll come back the 23rd and pick up with Genesis 6. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, so many things here to challenge us and to make us think. And we pray, Lord, that we would do that we would do it well, that we would be people who approach your word with our minds open, who approach our world with our minds open, and we can see the ways forward, that we can be faithful people, trusting your words, even in a world that tries to tell us that we can get by just fine without you. So grant us this for Jesus' sake. Amen.